In this video, we're going to create this animation using a flight path KML and Blender or Studio tools. This is a flight from London to Paris. I normally don't do these types of long form videos, but I'll go through the entire process of creating the Earth Studio project through Blender and then finally through After Effects for the final compositing. I'll run through the project in near real time, however I will edit or speed up when necessary. Let's start in Google and we'll do a search for FlightAware. And we'll use the FlightAware website to get some data from, or a KML file for a flight, and that's not the right field. So we'll do the search by route. We'll start in London, and then we'll go to Paris. And for those of you who aren't aware of FlightAware, it tracks in real time flights, as well as archives older flights. So we'll just select a flight from yesterday, and we'll pick this Air France flight from London Heathrow to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. And then when we scroll up, we can see that there's a View Track Log link. This is only available for older flights. And at the very top, there's a Google Earth button, which creates the KML file. So we'll save this KML file on our computer, and this will be the basis of our project. And we'll just give this a name here. We'll call this London to Paris, and save that. Now we'll open up Earth Studio, and we'll create a new project, or a blank project. We'll give the project a name, and we'll set our duration for similar 1/10 of the actual trip itself, or 10% of it rather. So it's a looks like it's a 1 hour and 3 minute flight. So we'll do a 1 minute animation, or approximately a minute animation, so it sort of lines up easily on the timeline. A minute and 15 in case we need to add some more at the beginning and at the end. First thing we'll do is we'll import that KML file. So with the FlightAware file, it's got a number of different layers within the KML. So we'll just select the route portion of it. We do not need the start point, end point, or the FlightAware logo. And you can see that the flight information is now displayed within Google Earth Studio. So I'm just going to jump ahead about 10 seconds or so, and we'll start setting our track points, or rather we'll start setting our keyframes and our camera target. So as you can see, this doesn't actually start with its data on the runway, but we can interpolate that once we get into Blender. So it's starting just a little bit out of the airfield. So I'm just going to go over top of it, set the camera target to the location where it starts. And I'm going to increase the altitude of the camera target so it aligns with the actual path itself. It's set at 16 meters right now, and we'll pull it all the way up to 781 meters. We just need it approximately on the same line here. We'll use the camera target along the way, so that we can follow in a consistent pattern the actual flight path itself. So we set the camera target at the beginning. We'll now set the camera target at the end. We can see it goes onto the runway here in Paris. So I'm just going to set the second camera target on the Paris runway. And I'll need to move my location back there again, because I'm still at the first location. And so I'll just sort of position myself here and set all keyframes. And looks like I wasn't exactly on the keyframe for the camera target. So delete where that one was alone. And we'll do this again. So we'll set all keyframes. And we'll just put those all on the edge there. So next thing I want to do is I want to start setting up some keyframes between the 2 points. Since we know that the actual flight takes 1 hour, or in our case, scaled down to 1 minute, we'll go to approximately the middle and select approximately the middle of the flight for our middle camera target. Again, setting our altitude now to 7,600 meters, which is the altitude of the flight. Now, since my camera is on the ground and I'm looking way up, I've actually lost control of the mouse to reposition the actual location of the camera. So to fix that, I'll just scroll ahead and let's see, I'll just do a manual adjustment to my position, increase my altitude. There we go. And now I'm unstuck. And we'll set that keyframe there in the middle. Now we just want to see if the camera target itself follows along the path properly. So any adjustments that we need to make. Now having the half, and we'll then half the 3/4. Again, adjusting my camera target's altitude. And you'll see it trying to cut the corner and go right to the airport, but in this flight plan, it did a loop around. So we're going to teach our camera target to go to the right place. Make a few adjustments here. And again, just setting some positions and some camera targets around the curve here. And you'll notice I am not actually adjusting any of the location points at this point. Basically, we'll have the camera just float in space there while the camera target does all the work. And so I'm going to speed up a little bit around here now. What I'll be doing is making some adjustments to the curves themselves of the camera target, as well as the position, just to smooth out the transition between the various targets. And so now those adjustments seem to be done. Let's set the time of this. So it was at 6 a.m. to 8:14. It looks like there's probably an hour difference between Paris and London. So we'll set our time of day, and we'll use the London time. So we'll set that to 6, which is Greenwich Mean Time in London. Nice sunrise. A little bit of a jump there, so I'm going to fix the handle on the altitude for the camera. It looks like I've got a little bit of a weird curve there as well. Anyways, we'll go to the end and we'll set our time for an hour later, which is 7. And so we'd be arriving in Paris. And that looks like it's pretty much going to work there. So let's save this. And we'll give it a render. So first thing we want to do is hide actually the route that is provided. So we have a clean render from Google Earth Studio. So we'll set that up. We're going to do the JSON file as well. Do a clean map style and high texture. And we're just going to render this in HD. So we'll click Start. And of course, what happens every time you do a render for the first time, I have forgotten something. So we will stop this and make our change. So we forgot to put our track points in here. So we're just going to show the route again, and we'll be adding a track point at our starting position. So we'll select our first point from the route and we will add our track point. We'll call this one Path Start. Just for reference, we're going to put one down at the end of the route as well. And we'll call this one Path End. And then because I know I'm going to be putting some objects on the runways, I'm just going to set myself some reference planes. So we'll put one on the Paris runway, and we'll also put one on the London runway. And now again, we'll turn off our overlay for the route as well, and we'll render this. For the second time. So it's going to give us a bracketed version. So these are when you do multiple versions of the same render. So this one's a bracket 1. That's fine. The actual file name will still be London Paris without the parentheses. And so we'll let that render away there. So now that's done, we'll open up Blender and import our Google Earth Studio project. So we'll just start with a blank canvas. We'll delete our default cube. And then since I already have the Earth Studio tools installed, I'm just going to press N, move to the Earth Studio import tab, and we'll find our image files for the render. And it's in that London Paris 1 folder. Go to the footage, and we'll select the first item and accept. Now we'll select our JSON file, which contains our camera and track point information. And there's the correct one there. And we'll import that as well. And then we'll click on the Import Earth Studio button. And so if you used this a couple times before, you're familiar with this interface. We're going to be using the camera to view. And we can then just scrub along the timeline, and it will show us the rendered images from Earth Studio. So we can see our objects there. This is the Paris runway plane. And here's the London runway. So we'll just do a quick check here, but everything's looking okay. So it looks like we're almost ready here to import our KML file. Just making sure we had our plane start right there by that pond or lake. So now we're just going to navigate to that KML file, accept that. We'll set our snap to the path start item. We'll set our curve to poly, which allows us to smooth the curve. We're going to set a default bevel depth to 0.05. We're not going to add any elevation. All the elevation is in the KML file. And so we don't even need to follow terrain. So we can just import the KML file. And you can see it there. Now, it's only showing a little bit of it. And this is a common Blender item. So we're just going to switch over to the camera and go to the clip start and end. And we'll set our clip end to 1,000 meters. And you can see now, we can see more of the route. Now, since we're going a fairly far distance, as well as a fairly high altitude, we'll just switching it over here to rendered view, we may lose it again. So as you can see, we've lost our route in the camera. So there it appears again. So that's 1,000 feet, or sorry, 1,000 meters from the object. So we're going to change that to 10,000 meters. And that should give us some room to actually see the object. And I'll select it here in a moment, but you can see that line coming through. Now, one of the things, obviously, when you do increase your altitude considerably, your line is not adjusting to the distance between the route and the camera. So we're going to manually make some adjustments there. There are also some automatic ways to do it, and we'll cover those in a future video. So I'm just going to select the route, press Tab to go into edit mode. We're going to select the first point. We want this to actually start on the runway, and we see we've only got one point there. We're going to create another point by pressing E on the keyboard, which is going to create a new point for us that we can then move while keeping the first point in its position. And what we want it to do is to actually snap to our runway plane here. So this makes sure that we're in the center of the runway as well as at the correct altitude. So we're going to use the snapping tool. We're going to select it to snap to the face, and then we'll turn on our magnet icon to snap to the actual plane surface. And plane as in not airplane, but as in a mesh plane. So anyways, it's snapping to the surface there, and that gives us a nice angle up to the first point that was provided in the KML file. Now we want to go along the runway, so I'm going to press E again and create another point. And just using the y-axis, we're going to drag it along the runway. We'll want to make sure that we either use the y or x axes and not adjust the vertical or z axes for this route. This way it maintains its position on the ground level. And so now we have a bit of a speed up along the runway for the takeoff, and then the altitude up to our first point provided in the KML file. I'm just going to add a little bit of color here so that we can see this better. It was looking a little bit gray there. We'll also turn on a sunlight so that we have light throughout the transition from London to Paris. And now we can faintly see the line. And we'll do our endpoint here. So again, select, press Tab, and then move the point along the X and Y axes. Now for the endpoint, there is usually two on top of each other. The reason for this is to allow for positioning based on altitude. If you don't need the final point, you'll find that there are certain benefits from removing one of the 2 points at the end there, with regards to when you apply objects as our cutaways. which we'll be doing here in a moment. So I'm just going to take one of our points, and I want to make sure I select the end one. There we go. And we're going to, again, using the magnet tool, the snap to tool, we'll drag it along the plane here. And we're actually under the surface, so I'm just going to drag it on the y-axis. Now we're going to need to see the actual image. And so we're off the runway a little bit there, so we'll use the x-axis to straighten it up visually. And again, being very careful not to adjust our Z or Z axes. And you can see all the various points along the way there. Now, if you did have a preference to make adjustments on the route, you can by all means adjust any of those points along the route. Use this technique in a number of different videos where you're able to go over particular buildings or make the route more visible depending on camera angle. And you can just raise or lower the actual point on the route path. So the route path is completely editable. So now we're going to work on our transition. We're going to select the route itself, and we'll set our mapping start and end type to spline. And then we're going to set a 0 keyframe at the very beginning. We'll go to where we want our reveal to end at the Charles de Gaulle Airport. And we'll set that to 1 or just slightly less than 1. And we can just type in a value here and see what works. 995 looks good. We'll set a keyframe there, and then we'll just slow down along the runway. So we'll bring that to a finish there in frame. And we'll set a keyframe there. Now we're just going to make adjustments to keyframes so that we have our reveal in frame throughout the entire video. So we just make adjustments to our endpoint. And we just go back and check to make sure that any previous keyframes don't affect the ones that come after it. Actually, I'm just going to change our active spline here. A little bit rough around the corner, so I'm going to increase our order U to the maximum amount of 6, which smooths out the corners and in between joints, so it looks a little bit nicer, especially when you're using something like a flight path. Unfortunately, when you do that, you're adjusting your spline length. If you think of the spline length like a string, you're curving it a little bit more around a corner, so you need to use a little bit more string. So I'll just go back to those previous keyframes that I've made and make some adjustments on those. And looks like we might need to put our endpoint U on. There we go. And so that looks like it's working fine there. Yep, and that's a good finish. So let's go back and make sure that we're good, and it's holding tight right now. Just increase the size of our bevel there for the moment so that we can see it a bit better as it crosses the English Channel. And we lose it out of frame there. So let's set a keyframe at this point where it's good. And then we'll go back and set a few keyframes so that we have the path in frame. And again, pressing I on the keyboard sets the keyframe when you hover your mouse over any one of the input fields. And so we want to make sure we got the takeoff in frame here as well. And that looks like a good one, so we'll set a keyframe there. Let's bring our bevel back down. We're just going to be using the varying bevel sizes just for visual reference for the time being. And we're just going to advance that one a little bit more too. And that looks good. Set a keyframe. So we've got about half a dozen keyframes along the route here just to ensure it's positioned correctly within frame. And I'll just scrub the whole video there just to make sure everything's good. And we look good there. So next thing we want to do is we want to change the shape of our route. So by default, it's going to use a round shape, which is fine for a lot of cases, but we want to square it off a little bit. So I'm just going to set my 3D origin to the plane itself on the runway, and I'm going to add a new plane object. Just slide it along the runway there. I'm going to scale it down to about the size of my starting plane. So that's about 35 meters there, my estimate. And so we've got a basic shape that we're going to have. So we'll use this sort of ribbon-like look. So once we've created the basic size that we have, we'll select Object, and then we want to convert this to a curve. Now it will lose its filling and just be an actual outline. We're now going to use this curve as our object to shape the route. So we'll select that object, and you'll see now the plane has taken on the shape of more of a rectangle ribbon style. Now it is not looking great right now. It's a little bit sideways. And if we turn off our smoothing, we can actually see the sharp edges, which is a nice look. To rotate it, so we want to tab in now to that plane, which is now a curve, and then we select it, and we're going to curve on the z-axis, so the blue axis, and this will adjust the twist of the actual route itself. And so that looks good as a starting point. And that looks good. Now, one of the things with the Earth, it just happens to be curved. So when you go from one point to another, things curve. So as we curve around from London to Paris, we've adjusted our position by several degrees. So you can see that it's now the route itself is slightly slanted as it arrives in Paris. So we'll want to correct that as well. And it looks like we're going underneath the plane surface as well, so we may not have set our height correctly. So we'll just going to move the plane here to the end. Again, maintaining the Z position. Then we'll tab into our route and turn, make sure that the snap is on. I'll lift up on the vertical. And actually, I'm going to go a little bit closer. I'm going to pull down on the vertical, and it will then snap to the surface vertically or on the Z-axis. And then I can adjust its position on the X and Y. And that looks fine. It's cutting into the plane itself, but once we fix our rotation at the end point, we'll be able to correct that. So what we'll need to do is have a starting rotation, which is correct, and then also an end rotation. Unfortunately, you can't just rotate the object and set keyframes. We need to do it a little bit differently. As you can see, when we rotate along the z-axis, it does not adjust the positioning or the rotation of the actual route. Now, when we go into edit mode and we rotate along the z-axis, you can see that it does adjust. So we'll need to add one of the add-ons here, which allows us to put keyframes in the actual edited objects. And so we'll select that, and it appears on our animation as animate on our tab. Let's select points, and we'll do the insert there. And let's go to the end here, and we'll set our finishing rotation. So again, we're in edit mode, and we're rotating all the points in edit mode. If all the points aren't selected, you can just press A, and it will select all the points. So then we'll insert that keyframe, and there we go. That looks good. So that's flattening out in Paris. And looks flat in London as well. So we got a bit of a rotation there along the trip, but it won't be perceivable. So we'll tab back out of that and into normal mode here again. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to make it so that we can size the path so it's visible to the camera along the route. We don't want it too big at the start point, and we obviously don't want it too small so we can't see it when we increase altitude. So we'll set a starting size. Now, different to the rotation, we're actually selecting the actual object. We're not in edit mode, although you could do it there as well. This is just a little bit easier. So we set our first keyframe for the size at around 30, 38. So there we go. We set the keyframe for our initial size. Let's move it along the path, and we'll size it up again. And so the scale, or the size of the route itself, the width, let's call it, of the route itself, will adjust along that path. And let's set a keyframe here as well. Again, we're just eyeballing this. There's no set pattern to it at all. We'll probably, again, end up with about half a dozen keyframes for the size. And as we come into the airport, we're going to be very large, take up 2 runways. So let's set our runway size here. And that looks pretty good. So let's set a keyframe there. All right, we got a nice finish there. So that makes the route visible along the entire length of the trip. So let's hide that and just make sure it looks good on its landing and takeoff. That all looks really nice. So the next thing we can do is we can attach an additional object to our route. And in this case, let's add an airplane. So I have the transportation add-on, which has a nice collection of different vehicles that I can use. And so I'm going to use the plane. And this looks like my style. Little small, but that's okay. And so we'll add that vehicle to our scene. And remember, we're in 1/100th scale in Blender to real world environments. So anything that we bring in that is correctly scaled, which these transportation objects are going to be 100 times larger than they should be in our scene. So I'm just going to snap that airplane to the runway. So this is actually 100 times bigger than it should be. There we go. That looks really big. So the correct size, that's 1/10 the size. So that's 10 times larger than real size. But we'll go ahead and use that because I think if we make it too much smaller, we won't be able to actually see it in the video. So what we want to do is we want to make this follow the path that we created. So we're going to click on the object constraints and then select follow path. We'll select the object that we're going to follow. So that would be the route path. And we want to make sure our up axis is the X axis in this particular instance. And we'll select follow curve. Now, if we jump back over to the actual route path and go to the curve properties, we'll see that now the path animation is checked. So what we want to do is we want this to obviously follow the path automatically. We don't want to have to re-keyframe this again. So to do that, we'll set our evaluation time to 0. We're going to position the plane in its starting position. So again, it was off because we obviously weren't at the starting position when we placed the plane. And we'll set our altitude and rotation. Flip it around here, make it face the correct direction. So we're just going to put it out here in front of our route path. And that looks pretty good. Go back into camera view. Now I'm at frame 60, which means we have to bring it back here probably for frame 0 or a starting point. And then we'll connect them up using drivers. So we want the evaluation time to link up to the progression of the start and end mapping, or more specifically, the end mapping. Got some location issues there with the plane, so there we go. Right at the start. Bring it forward just a bit. Again, reposition. So this is our first position of the plane. And that's on frame 1, which is our start frame. Okay, good. And it's locking in place because we haven't linked the evaluation time up to the position. So we're going to go to the evaluation time, and you can see just here how it will progress properly. So I'm just testing it out there. In some instances, you use the hash symbol. For example, if you want to hash it to frame. In our instance here, we want it to use a variable from another value. So we're going to use a driver. So we'll select add driver. And it defaults to a variable, which is the, the X location on the workspace. We don't want it to use that particular variable. So let's go into the driver editor and see how we can hook these up properly. There we go. I'm going to select the property, a curve property. So we'll select a curve here from the list. There we are. And then the property that we're looking for is the curve, which is the actual editable path. And then the path that we want to use is the end. So we're just going to right mouse click and say copy data driver. And then in the path area, we'll paste that in. And it looks like we're probably going to have to get rid of that first variable there and then adjust our expression. So that's fine. We're just getting rid of it. So, and then for our expression, we want to make sure we use that second variable. So var 001 plus 0. Now we want to have it multiply since we're using a 100 scale. So we want to multiply it by 100. So we're taking a decimal value, multiplying it by 100, and that will be its value for the evaluation. So that should all work out for us. So there we go. Now the plane will always be at the front of that route path. There we go, and that worked out great. Okay, so I think we're coming to the end here. Okay, I'm just going to hide the face masking on that there, the selected. So there we go, outline selected. There we go, you can see the plane. Let's have a look at some of our colors. I think that we're getting a bit dark when we get to Paris. Oh, we're just going to fix our rotation here first. When we land, we want to set a keyframe for landing. So we have a rotation at the beginning, which I set a keyframe for, and then a rotation at the end. We can do this at an object level as opposed to having to be in edit mode. The edit mode function is specifically for creating the shape routes. So everything else works like normal. Let's see what that scale looks like. That's 50% larger than it should be, but that looks better actually. Doesn't look too big for the runway. Okay, so let's have a look at a render here. So we're just going to do the in-screen compositing. So this is going to allow us to render directly from Blender. That's not my preferred method, but for those that don't have After Effects, it's an acceptable alternative. So we're going to use nodes is checked, obviously. We'll just move things around there. We're going to add a movie clip, and then we just select our existing movie from the list. We'll use the alpha over to combine the rendered layers and the movie clip layer. And let's render that out now. Have a look. We'll just do a render image. And that's a long render. So that airplane that we're using, okay, we've got our layers mixed up here. So we've got to put the top on the bottom and the bottom on the top. So we'll render the image. It was rendering fairly slow because of those vehicle models that we've added in here. We really don't need something high polygon count as we have here, but we'll let it be. Would recommend obviously using an appropriately scaled model. We could convert it and make it a lower make it lower poly to make the render a little bit quicker. But for the time being, we're just going to suffer through this. So anyways, if we're going to render this out through Blender itself, we would want to, first of all, make sure that we're hiding what we need to hide. So again, we're going to change our filter options there so that we can hide items. And I think I selected the wrong one because we still see that that one plane there. So yes, I've selected the display icon, and we want the actual camera icon. Yeah, there we go. So there's the camera icon. We'll hide that display icon, and we'll turn off rendering for, turn those displays back on so I can see them. We'll turn off rendering for the track points that we put in there. And now let's render this and see if this is okay. Yeah, and that looks good. So if we wanted this to be our final result out of Blender, we're on the home stretch. Now, I prefer to use After Effects for compositing because it gives me a few more choices, as well as some control over adding additional text or features, as well as ensuring the Google Earth logo is always visible in the renders. So as you can see there, the route passes over the logo there for a short time being, which is going to be okay for this particular example. But if I was going to be rendering something for production, I obviously would want to make sure that we're following all of the guidelines provided by Google. And so what we may want to do is once the, we might want to render this in a couple different segments, some with the airplane, but when the airplane gets too small or indistinguishable, we may want to hide it to speed up our render times. So anyways, we're just going to select an output for the video file that we'll render from here. And so I'm selecting the FFmpeg format for video, and then also the MPEG-4 container, and the H264, and it's going to go with high quality. And if we're going to render right out of Blender, this is where we do it. We would put on some ambient inclusion and some screen space reflections. Which reminds me, let's go and give ourselves some screen space reflections by adding an environment. So I'm just going to use the tool that's provided here within the transportation add-on to add an HDRI. Obviously, you could just download one from HDRI Haven and add it to your project. Just makes the lighting appear a little bit better. You get nicer lighting on the actual path itself. And it will be consistent throughout the scene. And so that looks good. And it's going to change the color here of our path so that it hits the light a little bit better. There we go. Add some glossiness to the actual path itself. Yep, that's going to look good. Guess I should probably save my Blender file now, since we're already an hour or so in. So anyways, that looked good. So we're rendering the animation. Now I'm only going to do a few frames of this one. I'm going to actually render the just the objects themselves and then composite them in Blender. So we'll stop this and do it the other way as well. So first thing we'll do is go into the compositing area. We'll just unconnect our background because we'll be using After Effects to add that. We'll do our test render here. And we still got it connected to the alpha over. So back to our compositing, we'll put that directly in there. We'll just put these here off to the side just in case we need them again. Let's do that test render. Pause the video here and we'll just set it back to our original settings. So that PNG, we'll make sure we got RGBA. So that's our alpha. Again, we'll just do one more test render, and then we set up our folder there for the render files. And so we'll set that to render the animation. Okay, so that finished rendering. Made a few adjustments to the render itself. The rendering portion where I couldn't actually see the airplane, I ended up hiding the airplane in a collection. And that sped up my render time down to less than half a second a frame. Also, for the final transition, I changed the color to fade out in the last few frames as well. Just sort of gave a nice finish to landing on the runway in Paris. So let's open up After Effects. And it's just opening up actually up on my other screen. So I'll bring it down here. We'll just create a new project. There it is. So I'm just going to right click in the project area. I'm going to add a new item and select our footage from Google Earth Studios. This is our London Paris render. Get to the right tab there. There we go. And drop that in place to create the composition. Then going to go to my render folder and import the images there. And I just drag them over top. And so again, this is basically our final composition. Not happy, however, with the transition over the English channel. I'd like that to be a little bit more defined. So I'm going to do another actual render from Google Earth Studio. So I'm going to flip back over there and go to the add attributes, and I'm going to turn off my time of day. So this is going to give me a brighter, not affected by light look. As you can see there, the contrast is quite considerable compared to the haziness, which is obviously designed that you get when looking in time of day mode. So I'll set that to render. I'll put it in another folder called London Paris No Time. And I'll set that to render. So this basically gives us two sets of renders. And within After Effects, we can then combine the two to produce a more usable result where we can highlight certain areas. So we'll just let that finish rendering off there. And then jumping back into After Effects, we'll now import those no time images. There we go. And we'll drag that down underneath the original image that we did. And you see the brightness difference there, especially when we go up into high altitudes. We don't necessarily want to use the full image there. So what we're going to do is we'll put the time of day image. We'll give it a bit of opacity, and this will allow us to blend the two images. So we'll start off probably around 90%. And then as we get over the English channel, we'll add a little bit more of the underlying image so we can see the coastline a little bit better. And that's what it looks like at 50%. I don't know if that's Might be a bit better there at 75%. And we'll sort of set another keyframe here, 75%, and then we'll bring it back into the original 90%. So it just gives us a little bit more control over the brightness and contrast of the image itself by combining the two image sets. Yeah, maybe 66 looks a little bit better. And I'll just get that adjustment a little bit more time to adjust so it's not noticeable. And we'll still get some colors from the landscape as well. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I'll also usually add a little bit of color control to the primary image. So I'm going to use lumimetry color. Just drag it over to the top image. I'm just going to add a little bit of saturation. And then I usually just do a fine tune. Now, I'm not really being accurate here. It's more eyeing it. But I'll increase the highlights and whites, decrease the shadows and blacks. Sort of a false contrast, but it makes things pop a little bit more and looks a little bit more different as well. And you can see there, it's just very subtle. And obviously for each scene, you'll want to make your own adjustments that look correct. So again, we'll save this After Effects file. Save that, and now we'll export it. So we'll just add it to the queue. Select a location for our final AVI. So the AVI format is a lossless format. I'll then usually bring this into a program like Premiere Pro and edit it together with other footage. And so let's look again at the final result. By all means, if you have any questions about this video, leave me a comment below. Thanks for your time, guys, and appreciate you watching this. And if you're not subscribed, hey, now's a good time to do it because we are at the end of the video. But thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon. Bye.